This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Toby Young, Daily Sceptic Editor-in-Chief and boss of the Free Speech Union, on the free speech travesties we saw this year and the battles to come in the year ahead.
They hate joy. It's as though Keir Starmer is Oliver Cromwell. Next on his list will be cancelling Christmas. We're about to become East Germany, and I'm not sure what we can do about it.
Sam Bidwell of the Adam Smith Institute on the woman who assaulted Nigel Farage with a milkshake who's been spared jail, and what this says about our justice system.
This decision will really upset a lot of people because the signal it sends out is that one of the categories of crime that the British state is not interested in policing is political violence, but only political violence when it's against a figure of the right. I would go as far as to say that it looks like a nakedly political judgment.
And for our premium subscribers, I'm joined by Niall Gooch, public servant and writer for The Spectator, The Critic and Unheard, on what it means for Conservatives when they can no longer trust their country's institutions.
If you look at what institutions are actually doing, what outcomes is that institution actually delivering, what values is it standing up for? In many, many cases, they're no longer fulfilling that aim. I think what's really striking is that even ones that shouldn't have a political mission now seem to regard themselves as having a political mission.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for The Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, I'm afraid to say that when it comes to free speech in Britain, it's not been a brilliant year. We've had scores locked up for social media posts, we've had non-crime hate incidents galore, and we've had journalists being visited by the police. But we've got a Labour government now, and by the looks of it, that means things can only get worse. So to discuss all that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Toby Young, the Daily Sceptic's Editor-in-Chief and founder and General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. Welcome to The Sceptic, Toby.
Thanks, Laurie.
So obviously the Free Speech Union was instrumental in shepherding that legislation through Parliament, and that passed last year. But Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, paused its commencement in August. And so, I mean, how much did that surprise you? How shocked were you that happened so quickly? And then, I mean, just give us an idea of where we're at now with that legislation.
Yes, well, I was pretty shocked, actually, by Bridget Phillipson's decision to torpedo the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. The most important clauses in that act were due to be commenced on August the 1st of this year. And Labour didn't win the general election until, July 4th. And me and others who'd been involved in this legislation were reasonably confident that Bridget Phillipson wouldn't have time enough to get her feet under the desk and actually torpedo the act before these clauses were commenced. I thought that they'd all be off partying in Tuscany, courtesy of Lord Alley, and wouldn't focus on urgent things that needed to be done and would just kind of be focused more on kind of the beginning of next term rather than what was due to happen, on August the 1st. But that turned out to be naive. And Bridget Phillipson did indeed torpedo the act. And I don't know if you know, Laurie, but the Free Speech Union is judicially reviewing Bridget Phillipson's decision. We think it was unlawful, and the High Court has given us a hearing date of January 23rd. It's possible that the act may be repealed, or the government may announce that they're going to repeal it in its entirety, in which case there isn't much we could do. The reason we think Bridget Phillipson's decision was unlawful is because it was essentially an example of a minister of the Crown defying the will of Parliament, which we're going to argue is a breach of a sacrosanct constitutional principle. But there's nothing to stop Labour using its majority to actually repeal the Act. That would be perfectly proper and constitutional. But they didn't do that. But they may announce next week before, probably on the day this podcast drops. That's known as taking out the trash day in Parliament. It's the last day Parliament sits before it goes into recess for the Christmas break, and lots of things are announced on that day. This year, I think it's December 19th. So it's possible that an announcement may be made, and that the government will decide to repeal the Act in its entirety, in which case I think our case just falls away. It's also possible that the government may decide to part commence the remaining clauses of the bill. And whether or not we decide to fight on in those circumstances will depend on what they decide to commence and what they decide not to commence. So it may be that we'll have a decision to make next week. Probably more likely, Laurie, is that they won't say anything, in which case our case will go ahead on January 23rd. And if we win, it'll be as if Bridget Phillipson's decision had never been made, and the Act will just, in effect, it'll be as if all the clauses did commence on August 1st, although that in itself creates kind of constitutional difficulties. But anyway, it's all in play. But I'm reasonably optimistic that if the government makes no announcement before January 23rd, we have a reasonably good chance of winning our case. But I think partly for that reason, the government will probably part commence at some point. And then we'll have to decide whether to continue or not. I guess I had pretty low expectations of Keir Starmer and this government. But even by the standards of those very low expectations, I think he's underperformed when it comes to free speech. Not just free speech, but across almost every area. But the response by the authorities to the riots that followed the Southport attack, I think, shocked everybody, blaming misinformation, disinformation on social media, and Elon Musk in particular, as a sort of the primary cause of the social unrest over the summer, was pretty shocking. It was as though, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Let's take advantage of this outbreak of social disorder to lock people up for saying things on social media, and send a shot across everyone's bows that if they publicly challenge some of the sacred values of Starmer's Britain, they'll be sent to jail. Pretty extraordinary. I think when I last checked, almost 100 people had been charged with criminal offences for various things they said on social media about the Southport attack and the subsequent unrest. And the Free Speech Union is suddenly involved in lots of criminal cases, which we haven't really been before. We have a handful, but nothing like at this scale. But we've had to up our game when it comes to the criminal law. We've engaged various criminal solicitors and barristers were involved in appealing some of the convictions and the sentences. In those, there's one rare case in which someone actually was accused of stirring up racial hatred because of a fairly mild Facebook video they posted, and this person's pleaded not guilty. So his trial is forthcoming, and we've got him a barrister and a solicitor, and we're hoping he won't be convicted. But as you know, most of the people accused of various criminal offences because of things they posted, or in one case reposted, actually more than one case reposted on social media, they pled guilty. And it's much harder to defend people if they've pled guilty. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And we're in the case of Lucy Connolly, for instance, we're looking into whether we can appeal her sentence and her conviction. And we're hoping to get some news on that shortly. And she pled guilty, which I think was inadvisable. But
Okay, and so what about non-crime hate incidents? Where are we at with that?
well, one other thing that's happened this year is obviously there's been a lot of media coverage of non-crime hate incidents following two police officers turning up on the doorstep of Alison Pearson on Remembrance Sunday, and at least giving her the impression that they were investigating a non-crime hate incident rather than a hate crime. And I think for the first time, there's been real cut through. I mean, the FSU has been campaigning against non-crime hate incidents for almost 5 years, and we were involved in Harry Miller's case in the High Court and the Court of Appeal. But not many people had really twigged, I don't think, that you can get into trouble for hurty words, even if the police conclude that you haven't committed a crime. But I think now that that has kind of finally cut through, and there was quite an encouraging story in the Telegraph. I guess it'll be last week by the time this is broadcast, but actually it was this morning, in which Nick Herbert, the chairman of the College of Policing, said that they were going to have a review of non-crime hate incidents, which was slightly odd because the College of Policing came up with the concept in the first place when Nick Herbert was chair, as far as I know. It was as though he was saying, yes, this slightly odd thing's been foisted on us and we're going to have to look closely at it. It was like, no, you foisted it on the police. It wasn't foisted on you. And also he was quite cautious. I think the Telegraph headline exaggerated exactly what he'd said, and it looks like it looks to me as though what Yvette Cooper and the College of Policing want to do is repeal the statutory instrument that Suella Braverman laid last year, which was an attempt to. It was a statutory instrument which established a code of practice when it came to the recording and retention of NCHIs, and it stipulated the circumstances in which they could be recorded and retained, in the hope that the police would investigate, record, and retain far fewer. And it hasn't had that effect. And I think Nick Herbert said in this Telegraph piece that was because, the advice hadn't been properly understood. Police were just confused. There was no consistency. Well, there was no consistency before the statutory instrument was laid. And if the police haven't understood that they need to comply with this code of practice now when it comes to the recording and retention of NCHIs, that's because the College of Policing haven't communicated it to chief constables in England and Wales. So really they're at fault, I think. But I think what Yvette Cooper and the College of Policing would like to do is just repeal that statutory instrument and leave it to the College of Policing to come up with a code of practice, which is what existed before the statutory code of practice was put in place. And certainly, not only did it allow for, we think, more than 250,000 NCHIs to be recorded in England and Wales since 2014, but it was also unlawful, according to the Court of Appeal, which is one of the reasons Suella Braverman introduced the statutory code of practice to try and put the investigation, recording and retention of NCHIs on a lawful footing. And I'm not terribly confident that if the statutory instrument is repealed and we leave it, we put it back in the hands of the College of Policing, that they'll behave properly, lawfully, etc. And Yvette Cooper has actually said that she wants the police to record more, not fewer NCHIs when it comes to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, which seems like a rather tone-deaf response to the public outcry about NCHIs following Alison Pearson's case. But nevertheless, it wouldn't surprise me in the least if actually there's a big ramping up in the recording of NCHIs next year. I mean, they've already ramped up since the statutory instrument was passed, effectively defying the will of Parliament. And I imagine they'll just ramp up again in the next 12 months.
So you mentioned Islamophobia there and Labour's sort of favourability to those kinds of ideas. And so, I mean, tell us about the prospects of that in the coming year. And I suppose in particular, how worrying is that, given that we recently, of course, had one of the pro-Gaza independent MPs stand up in the Commons and basically say, you need to bring in a blasphemy law. And Keir Starmer, far from saying, no, that's not something we do in this country, said essentially that he agreed with the general idea of sort of, as it was put, not desecrating religious symbols or something like this.
We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms.
He certainly didn't shut this down. I mean, how worrying was that?
Yeah, no, I think his response to that question was alarming. I think Labour would probably hesitate before bringing in a blasphemy law, at least via the front door. I think it would be at odds with their, self-understanding as primarily, a secular humanist government, and I think bringing in a blasphemy law would be a step too far, even for Sir Keir. But that's not to say they won't try and criminalise Islamophobia in particular via the back door. The Labour Party has already embraced the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which is incredibly broad. But two things in particular it includes are: one, anyone who claims that Islam has been imposed by force on populations conquered by Muslim armies is guilty of Islamophobia. So that would mean, any historian who's accurately depicted the history of Islam would be guilty of Islamophobia, including Tom Holland. So it's not clear, if Islamophobia, so defined, did become a criminal offence. I guess Tom Holland's publisher would have to pulp all his books, and maybe Tom Holland himself would have to renounce his own blasphemy. There's also another aspect of this unbelievably broad APPG definition of Islamophobia, is that it would include anyone who challenges a Muslim majority country that has accused another country of anti-Muslim genocide. So that would mean that if Iran, for instance, has accused Israel of committing genocide against the population of Gaza, which is a Muslim population. So anyone challenging Iran's claim that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza would be guilty of Islamophobia. So far, this hasn't been incorporated into British law, even though the Labour Party thinks this definition is perfectly fine. It has been adopted by various local authorities, Labour-run local authorities across the country. And anyone guilty of Islamophobia, according to this unbelievably capacious definition, can be sacked from their job working for the local authority. Any councillors challenging Iran's claim about Israel committing genocide could get into trouble. But beyond that, so far, it hasn't been kind of embedded in the law. Speech codes, disciplinary codes, but not the criminal law. But one way in which Starmer could do that is that he could, at the moment, in order to be prosecuted for stirring up racial hatred, the authorities don't have to show that you intended to stir up racial hatred, only that your words had the effect, or were likely to have the effect. No, it doesn't. You have to show they had the effect, but you have to show it's enough to say your words were likely to stir up racial hatred, and you should have known that. So therefore, what you did was reckless, and you're guilty of a stirring up offence. When it comes to stirring up religious hatred, the threshold is higher. You can't prosecute someone for stirring up religious hatred unless you can show that they intended to stir up religious hatred. It's not enough that that was a likely consequence of what they said. You have to be able to show intent. And one way, I think, in which Keir Starmer could make it easier to prosecute people for Islamophobia is to lower the threshold for prosecuting people for stirring up religious hatred, to bring it into line with the threshold for prosecuting people for stirring up racial hatred. I don't think that's beyond the realms of possibility. And I think that could be done with a statutory instrument rather than via primary legislation. And, you know, who's to say he won't do it? I think it's probably more likely than not that he will. And it could be presented as, you know, I'm just tidying up the this anomaly in the Public Order Act, whereby the prosecutorial threshold for stirring up religious hatred is weirdly higher than it is for stirring up racial hatred. I just want to tidy it up, make sure it's all consistent and all fits together better. That would be the argument. But that may be, rather than, it might well be that that's actually proposed by the Law Commission of England and Wales. So in 2021, the Law Commission of England and Wales proposed that a hate crime public order England and Wales bill be brought before Parliament, which was almost identical, if not slightly worse, than the Hate Crime Public Order Scotland Act. And the Free Speech Union and others vigorously opposed this, and it was shelved, but it wasn't. It was sort of kicked into the long grass. But the Law Commission of England and Wales has an oven-ready Westminster version of the Scottish Hate Crime Act, and I imagine, you know, if they present it to Yvette Cooper, it would get a much better reception than it did when they presented it to various Conservative Home Secretaries. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's where we see the lowering of the prosecutorial threshold for stirring up religious hatred, and ergo the criminalisation of Islamophobia. It'll appear in the form of a recommendation by the Law Commission of England and Wales, which will result in a Westminster version of Scotland's Hate Crime Act, and that may well be something we'll see in the next year.
Okay, and so we've been talking about all kinds of speech online being censored and criminalised, and other kinds of speech as well. But one place people might imagine they could go to get away from all that is the pub. And, you know, they can have a nice, frank conversation over a beer and then forget about it the next day and you know, carry on with their lives. But, well, you've been writing about the Employment Rights Bill, which could be coming in next year. And in it, there's this grim prospect of what you called the Banter police, which could, you know, be affecting pubs and many other places as well. I mean, just tell us a bit about that, Toby.
Yeah, so another of the Free Speech Union's legislative victories in the last Parliament was to neuter something called, well, it was then the Worker Protection Bill, it's now the Worker Protection Act. And it was a private member's bill brought forward by a Labour and Lib Dem, two Labour and Lib Dem peers. But we suspected at the time that this bill had actually been drafted by activist civil servants in the Government Equality Office. And it takes a while to explain this, and it's quite difficult to campaign against it because it takes so bloody long to explain it. So it is quite complicated, but it will have, I think, a more chilling effect on free speech than anything else under this present government. So you may recall that there was a scandal a few years ago at the Dorchester Hotel. I think it was the Dorchester, in which this plutocratic charity called the President's Club held an event in the hotel and a couple of FT journalists went undercover and got employed as waitresses at this event and were sexually harassed by various men who attended it. It was a fundraising event. And they wrote about this in the FT. And it emerged that temporary employees of the Dorchester, couldn't sue any of these men for sexual harassment or the President's Club for sexual harassment because employers had no liability for the sexual harassment of their employees by third parties. The Equality Act makes employers liable for sexual harassment by their employees by other employees, as it does other forms of harassment, but not by third parties. So the Worker Protection Bill was brought in ostensibly to extend employer liability for sexual harassment to third-party sexual harassment to prevent a repeat of something like the President's Club scandal. But at the same time as extending employer liability for third-party sexual harassment to third-party sexual harassment, it extended it for all forms of third-party harassment. Now, according to the Employment Tribunal, if an employee overhears two other employees having a conversation in which they say something likely to upset or offend someone with a protected characteristic, they can complain to their employer. They can actually sue their employer for not doing more to protect people with protected characteristics from overhearing these upsetting and offensive conversations. So overheard conversations count as harassment, and employers are expected to take all reasonable steps to prevent their employees from being harassed, including being harassed in this way. So if you extend employer liability for harassment of their employees to third-party harassment, not just sexual harassment, but all forms of harassment, you're effectively saying, henceforth, employers must take all reasonable steps to protect their employees from overhearing conversations being held by members of the public, which may offend employees in virtue of their protected characteristics. We thought this was absurd. I mean, there are lots of arguments against it, but one argument is, well, what does that mean for, the hospitality sector? Will publicans have to take all reasonable steps to protect bar staff from overhearing conversations between pub customers that might upset or offend someone with a protected characteristic? Does that mean that pubs henceforth will have to employ banter bouncers to eavesdrop on conversations and bar anyone sort of telling a dirty joke or saying something quote unquote inappropriate? What about in football stadiums? Does it mean that any fan shouting at a linesman who's just ruled a goal offside, "Are you blind?" that fan will have to be kicked out of the stadium because that comment could be overheard by a partially sighted steward or employee of the football club? And that also applies to various other chants or things that football fans say. We thought that, that gag at when people go to see Arsenal at the Emirates, the opposing fans chant, "Is this a library? Is this a library?" because the Arsenal fans are too busy eating their prawn sandwiches to actually cheer on their team. But not anymore. Maybe not. But anyway, in future, it's as though, every stadium will be a library, and when the opposing fans at Arsenal start chanting, "Is this a library?" the Arsenal fans will be able to point to Sir Keir in his executive box and go, "Yes, yes, shh." But anyway, so we the Free Speech Union circulated a briefing doc setting out the horrendous implications for extending employer liability to include third-party harassment of their employees, and what a devastating impact it would have on the hospitality sector. And various peers pointed this out and threatened to talk out the bill because it was a private member's bill. And even though the last government was supporting this bill, eventually this clause was stripped out, and all the Worker Protection Act did when it became law was extend employer liability for third-party sexual harassment and nothing else. We thought we'd won that battle, but the very same clause that we'd successfully got stripped out of the Worker Protection Bill has resurfaced almost word for word in the Employment Rights Bill, which is Angela Rayner's big bill. And I think that, to me, makes it crystal clear that the private members bill was indeed drafted by civil servant activists in the Government Equalities Office. They thought, oh, well, we were defeated the last time we tried to get this clause on the statute books. We'll just stick it in another bill, which is what they've done. I'd be surprised if Angela Rayner is even aware of this clause. I don't suppose she's actually read her bill. But there's been no effort by the government to actually defend this clause. But it's right there. And unlike last time, this isn't a private member's bill. This is a government bill, and the government has a huge parliamentary majority. So in all likelihood, this will become law next year. And it will just have an absolutely devastating effect on the hospitality sector. It'll be as if the chilling effect of the Equality Act on workplaces up and down the country, which has everyone looking over their shoulder before they say anything, will be extended now to our leisure hours, like pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, sports stadiums. It'll be as if the Equality Act and all its implications now applies to all those areas of our lives. And anything we say that can potentially upset, a woke activist will be grounds for barring us from any of those venues or activities. So, we are literally about to become East Germany, thanks to this clause in the Employment Rights Bill, and I'm not sure what we can do about it.
Okay, so Toby, you're an associate editor at The Spectator, and now there's been a recent ruling by IPSO, so the Independent Press Standards Organisation, against The Spectator for an online piece published by the writer Gareth Roberts from earlier this year, where he refers to a trans woman as a man, which of course is true, and also was his opinion. And but they had to publish an apology for that. And that is potentially spelling the withdrawal of The Spectator from IPSO and potentially the collapse of that particular regulator. But that could then mean the arrival of what has long been hoped for, actually, by certain activists from Hacked Off and other places in the wake of the Leveson inquiry, which is to say a state-backed press regulator. I mean, how worrying of a prospect is that?
Yeah, I think it is a worrying prospect. I think, it's very unfortunate that IPSO should have upheld this complaint, or one aspect of this complaint against The Spectator. It's troubling for all sorts of reasons. It seems to be IPSO straying into sanctioning its members for not towing a particular political line, rather than just upholding the editor's code when it comes to accuracy and intrusion. It's partly, I think, because we see this all over the place, Laurie, that various institutions which are ostensibly politically neutral and are supposed to be above the political fray, like the civil service, like the NHS, like the police, have embraced gender identity ideology because they think of it as not being politically contentious. They see it as in the same ballpark as being anti-racist, being anti-homophobic. And so it doesn't count as politically contentious. It's something we all agree about, or any right-minded person agrees with. As we know, when it comes to gender identity ideology, there isn't anything like the consensus that there is when it comes to tackling racism and homophobia. I think Ipso has perhaps inadvertently strayed into a political minefield, and has very unwisely decided to side with this trans activist and sanction the Spectator. I think that if Ipso is expecting its members henceforth to instruct its journalists not to dead name or misgender trans women, given that the belief in the biological reality of sex is a protected belief under the Equality Act, and given Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, I think it's likely. I haven't kind of sought proper legal advice about this yet, but I think it's likely that Ipso is effectively asking its members to, in certain circumstances, behave unlawfully. It's expecting its members to breach the speech rights of its staff journalists, which I think in certain circumstances could be unlawful. And if that's the case, then Ipso's members will have no choice but to leave Ipso. Remaining in Ipso could render them vulnerable to being sued by their staff journalists for breaching their speech rights.
And of course, with gender-critical beliefs now protected under the Equality Act.
Yes, well, there's an Equality Act argument, and there's also a Human Rights Act argument. And I think you might be able to make an argument on both grounds that for a newspaper or magazine to order its journalists to effectively affirm a belief that they don't hold would be a breach of their speech rights under the, well, there'd be a breach of, it would be unlawful discrimination, belief discrimination under the Equality Act, and a breach of their speech rights under the Human Rights Act. Anyway, if that turns out to be true, then Ipso's members will have no choice but to leave Ipso, unless Ipso goes back on this. And that would be the best outcome. If the Spectator threatens to leave and other publications threaten to leave, unless it goes back on this, then I would hope that Ipso would go back on it, because otherwise it looks as though Ipso would collapse. And the real risk of Ipso collapsing, as you say, is that that then opens the door, that gives the government an excuse to press ahead with what's colloquially referred to as Leveson 2, which would effectively be to bring forward legislation forcing newspapers and magazines to sign up with a state-approved press regulator. There is one called Impress, which very few respectable publications have signed up to, but it does have the seal of official approval. And I believe the chairman of Impress is appointed by the Secretary of State at DCMS. Anyway, this was very much on the agenda of Hacked Off, and they were deeply, people like Ed Miliband, Chris Bryant and others, deeply frustrated that magazines and newspapers haven't been forced to bend the knee to a state press regulator. And I'm sure they're champing at the bit to take advantage of Labour's massive majority to now bring this in. It was in Labour's 2015 manifesto, and it was also, I think, in its 2017 manifesto. It wasn't in the 2020... I think it was in the 2019 manifesto as well, but wasn't in the 2024 manifesto. But that's not to say they won't do it if they get half a chance. And I think this would give them half a chance. So I think that's the real danger here, that we've embarked on a path because of this bizarre decision by Ipso that could lead to state regulation of the press.
Okay, so we can't escape this stuff online. We can't escape this stuff in pubs. The press can't escape this stuff. But what about if we want to just head down to the football?
So another bill that the government has introduced, which will undoubtedly have a chilling effect on free speech, is the Football Governance Bill. God knows why this government wants to regulate one of Britain's most successful businesses, the Premier League. But nevertheless, it's taken it into its head that this must be regulated. And one of the clauses in the Football Governance Bill requires football clubs to do more to promote equity. Actually, I think equality. They don't use the word equity. The word in the bill is equality, diversity, and inclusion. And the new football regulator will be required to come up with a kind of model policy, a model EDI policy that football clubs will be expected to embrace. And the idea that football clubs aren't doing enough to promote EDI at the moment, and need to do much more to protect, football fans with protected characteristics, need to do more to kind of promote diversity within their clubs. The idea that they're not doing enough is just breathtaking. We've got a case at the Free Speech Union of a woman called Lindsay Smith, who's been a lifelong Newcastle United fan. And she essentially said on X that she didn't think trans women are women. And a trans activist complained to Newcastle that this was a breach of Newcastle's EDI policy. And instead of telling this complainant to take a hike because she didn't say it in the stadium, she didn't say it to a player or an official or even another fan, she just said it on X. They took the complaint very seriously, upheld it, and banned Lindsay for 2 seasons. And the Free Speech Union has taken on that case, and we're hoping to get the ban overturned. But that's how much football clubs are doing at the moment to enforce EDI. If you say on social media you don't think trans women are women, at least one football club, and probably more, think that's grounds for banning you from attending football games. You've dissented from this particular shibboleth, and that's heresy, and they don't want heretics in football stadiums. But this government thinks that the clubs like Newcastle aren't going nearly far enough. I mean, it is extraordinary. So in combination with the Employment Rights Bill, the Football Governance Bill will just have a devastating effect on the atmosphere in football stadiums. No one will be able to raise their voice, lest they be overheard by some vexatious woke activist or, banter bouncers employed by the football club to eavesdrop on conversations to make sure no one's saying anything inappropriate. I mean, it'll be extraordinary, but they will. Every football stadium in the country will become a library as a result of this bill in combination with the Employment Rights Bill. I mean, it's as though Keir Starmer is Oliver Cromwell. Next on his list will be cancelling Christmas. They hate joy. They hate any sort of pleasure, anything out of school, anything which isn't officially overseen. The idea that we can enjoy a bit of downtime, an opportunity to sometimes let off steam, that we sometimes behave or say inappropriate things, when we've had a few drinks in football stadiums or in pubs, bars, restaurants. They hate that. They hate it. They want everything to be regulated and officially overseen. They want a vast army of informants out there, making sure no one dissents from any aspect of radical progressive ideology. I mean, it is extraordinary. It's it's totalitarianism dressed up as inclusion.
Well, on that cheery note, I think that's all we've got time for. Toby Young, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks, Laurie.
This week, we had the sentencing of Victoria Thomas Bowen, the woman who, in early June, threw a milkshake at Reform UK leader Nigel Farage as he campaigned in his now constituency of Clacton. Ms Thomas Bowen had pleaded guilty to assault by beating and criminal damage, and so the question was, what was the sentence going to be? This is in the context, of course, of many people in the past 6 months especially having gone to prison for social media offences for things said online. Not very nice things, certainly, but certainly not an actual act of violence. Farage told the court he felt humiliated by the incident and was left fearing for his safety in public. But Miss Thomas Bowen has received no prison time. Instead, at Westminster Magistrates Court, Deputy District Judge Tan Ikram handed down a 13-week jail sentence suspended for 12 months, as well as 120 hours of community service. So, is this two-tier justice? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Sam Bidwell, Director of the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute and a writer for publications including The Critic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Sam.
Thanks for having me, Laurie.
Okay, so obviously there's been a big outcry about this and claims of two-tier justice here. And partly this is focused on this judge in particular and his record in sentencing. And in fact, I've reported quite a lot on this in that he's given out some very harsh judgments against police officers in particular for speech. But he's also been quite lenient for other kinds of speech, which has given rise to a perception that he might have some bias. And in fact, he's already been reprimanded for appearing to show bias in a previous case for having liked an anti-Israel post. So why do you think this ruling has resonated with people, Sam?
Sure. Look, I think we've got to put this decision into context. So for a very long time now, the British police have effectively stopped enforcing the law on certain petty crimes. Shoplifting now is barely enforced in cities like London. And at the same time, they've also been cracking down on speech offences. So we have a number of laws on the books, including the Communications Act, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about later, which allows speech to be criminalised. And we've seen that legislation used particularly in the context of this summer, but also more broadly, this is something that characterises the headlines from time to time. Anyway, and so within that context, where we're policing speech more tightly, but we're also ignoring a number of petty crimes, this whole conviction, this whole situation with Farage just contributes again to that sense that the British state is not interested in serious crime, but it is interested in making political rulings about how people behave around politicians. Because we've seen in just the past few years, the so-called Corbyn egger, the so-called Brexiteer who threw eggs at Jeremy Corbyn, received a rather stiff sentence for doing so. We've seen a man who shouted at former Conservative MP Anna Soubry, received a pretty stiff sentence again on speech grounds. And it's within that context that this decision will really upset a lot of people, because the signal it sends out is that one of the categories of crime that the British state is not interested in policing is political violence, but only political violence when it's against a figure of the right. I would go as far as to say that it looks like a nakedly political judgment, particularly when considered against the backdrop of that Corbyn decision.
And because, of course, you could look at the letter of the law here and conclude that this ruling, there was nothing wrong with it necessarily from a legal point of view, because it didn't necessarily meet the threshold for more serious violence. You know, it wasn't acid or something, and she didn't hit him multiple times and things like this. But there is a certain amount of discretion which could be applied to say, well, actually, this is particularly serious because it's an assault on a politician while he's campaigning, and it's therefore an assault on democracy, right? And so, but that discretion doesn't seem to have been applied here. And of course, one of the reasons people are annoyed about this judge in particular is that he has applied such discretion in previous cases. So, for instance, to take one in particular, when he sentenced police officer James Watts to 20 weeks in prison in 2022 for racist messages in a private WhatsApp, when he delivered his judgment, he said, a message must go out. And in fact, later on, he made comments to American law students, for some reason, saying that he thought the police were institutionally racist, essentially, and that he had a sort of a duty to try and do something about this. And so in this one case, it seems he thought that he needed to send a particularly harsh message with his sentencing. But in this other case, where a right-wing politician is being attacked, he doesn't seem to have felt the need to do that. I mean, that's one reason to be angry, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, let's put this into context. The common law system that we've had in England, certainly, and in other parts of Britain for shorter periods of time, it's about 1,000 years old, however you slice it, and it gives a lot of discretion to judges. It has always given that discretion to judges. You go back to the decisions of conservative judges like Lord Denning. They make calls back in the 20th century, which could be seen to be more lenient, where people are expressing what people like Denning would assume to be sort of ancient English liberties. The difference is that those rules were designed at a time or evolved at a time when we had a relatively high trust society, and when the kind of person going into the judiciary had a clear sense of the principles that had made the country so successful, right? Basic level of individual liberty, consistency of application of the law, protection of political and administrative figures. These were all things that made Britain, England in particular, so successful over the years. And when we put people through to train as lawyers or judges, they had a very clear sense of those principles. That's now no longer the case. What we have is a judiciary that is filled with activists, and not everybody, but there are a great number of activists there now who have very little respect for ideas like the rule of law as traditionally applied, traditionally construed. Certainly, they have very little interest in ideas like liberty and individualism. And so Tan Ekram is perfectly within his rights to make determinations in this way. The problem is the law, and that we've put so many people into that system who no longer share the ethics and norms that underpin the judicial system that they're now empowered to administrate. I mean, in this particular case, I think it's really striking because we've seen such a hubbub in Westminster about political violence over the last few years, and rightly so. Right, we have had members of Parliament. Joe Cox is the obvious example, but also David Amess, who was killed by an Islamist at his constituency surgery. We've seen members of Parliament killed. We have seen members of Parliament intimidated, though I note generally by those of the left and indeed Islamists, or certainly at least those interested primarily in the cause of Gaza, generally people more on that side than on the side of the right, but it can happen on both sides too. But we have seen a renewed interest in political violence as an issue at Westminster. And yet it seems to me that because of the political leanings of the current MP for Clacton, Nigel Farage, the decision in this case has been reached differently than it would have done if it were, let's say, Ed Davey or certainly Sir Keir Starmer or a figure of the centre left. It will be very difficult for people to understand why Jeremy Corbyn's Egger received the sentence that he did and this lady received the sentence that she did. And they will conclude that this was a political decision made by an activist judge.
Yes, and it's a good point you make about David Amess there, because there has been this intense focus on MPs' safety in recent years, and rightly so. But of course, with David Amess, what you had was this situation where there was MP's safety, and then it was MP's safety online, and then it was suddenly the Online Safety Act. And this was not really about MP's physical safety. It was about protecting them and others, I suppose, but from hurty words on the internet, right? And that's quite unlike the physical violence that Nigel Farage has just experienced from this woman. And I think that really signals something that's very symptomatic of our political class, this extreme focus on online speech to the detriment of actual violence in person. And of course, we've got the Communications Act as well, which specifically criminalises certain types of online speech. I mean, why do you think our state seems to take online speech more seriously than actual violence?
So there's this great phrase that you can apply to so many aspects of the modern British state. The phrase is anarcho-tyranny. So when states lose capacity and when they lose control, they begin to enforce laws more stringently against the law-abiding and less stringently against the law infringing. And the reason is simply a question of pushback. So if you put some mother from Rochdale in prison for a tweet or a Facebook, more likely a Facebook post, she's very unlikely, and her community, crucially, is very unlikely to push back against you in a large way. We are particularly in Britain, we're an individualized culture. We have been for hundreds of years, and so we don't kind of close ranks around people who are touched on by the state, often inappropriately. We don't have that culture of collective action. Other communities do, and other groups of people and other political groups within society do, and so the state has become averse to applying the law there because they know there's going to be such enormous pushback. We saw this in Hare Hills with the case of the Romani family, which had a child taken away by Child Protective Services. We saw enormous community backlash. We saw rioting. We saw, buses set on fire, all that sort of thing. The state now knows that it isn't capable or isn't willing. There's a great degree of willingness here. It's not willing to go through with what it takes to deal properly with violent crime, with disorder, with the kind of political backlash that comes with that. Had the lady in this Farage case received a stiff sentence, you can guarantee that there would have been months of political campaigning, of appeals, of people saying the state is closing ranks behind Nigel Farage and is protecting a fascist. You would have had all that backlash compared to these cases of speech where actually we're able to isolate people and say, well, you're going to go behind bars for this thing you've written online. It's just easier. It's just easier. And we have a state which operates basically on the principle of something must be done about this. It's fairly agnostic as to what's done about it, but as long as something's seen to be done, they will go for that for them is job done. And so they will always go for the easy, the low-hanging fruit, and that will generally be speech offences. I also think, aside that, that's the kind of case for the median bureaucrat within the British state. There is also a genuine ideological belief that negative speech leads to real-life harms amongst a lot of our politicians. I think if you force them, you got them on the spot and you force them to interrogate whether they really support the Communications Act or the Public Order Act, and the way the Public Order Act also infringes upon speech, many of them would say yes. They would say, actually, yes, there is a link between violent speech or hate speech and genuine violence. Many of them would say that it's more important to protect community cohesion than it is to protect the right to freedom of speech. Again, if you kind of gave them the truth serum, they wouldn't admit this in public, as it were. But we are genuinely sacrificing the right to freedom of speech on the altar of community cohesion. That is a thing that is actually happening already now in Britain. It isn't hypothetical; it's already the law. So you have, you combine the kind of pencil pushing bureaucrat who just wants to get something done to prove that they're taking action, with that kind of political ideological instinct, and all of a sudden you get what we have now, which is a set of speech laws that are stricter than our laws on violent crime in many ways. Right.
And so another ideology that's made its way into the law here is the racial question here, right? And with the idea of racially aggravated offences. And of course, this is partly something that people feel very strongly about anyway. It's a social taboo, but it's also written into the law as well. And one of the things I've been writing about in relation to the riots in particular is that the way a lot of these online offences have worked essentially is that you couldn't really draw a clear, direct material link to them having incited violence. But what you could basically say was that they had stepped over a sacred taboo in some way. I mean, for instance, in the case of Cameron Bell, she referred to migrants as tramps, and this was in a live stream after a riot. But it seemed essentially to work as a kind of blasphemy law against multiculturalism writ large. And, how big an effect do you think that has been of having these racially aggravated crimes enshrined into law?
Enormously. I mean, look, it is worth putting the current system into context. Multicultural societies basically tend to go one of two ways. Right? Throughout all of history, they go one of two ways. One group becomes supremacist. That's route one, and we're certainly not there. Right? There's no specific protection or superiority in law for one ethnic group. So you couldn't live in a country like Malaysia. The Bumiputras, the native Malay, has elevated legal status under the constitution. We're not in that position. The second way that multicultural societies tend to go is cohesion above all, right? And that's you, in your nicest example, that's somewhere like Singapore, which still has its problems in terms of cohesion. But many, some multicultural societies move towards a position where they say, okay, the thing we're going to prioritize above all is making sure that the relations between groups are cohesive and that nobody upsets anybody else. Now, of course, what that does is it severely restricts things like freedom of speech and freedom of association. But it's one way that states deal with community tensions, because what we tend to find is that that's easier than dealing with the problem head on and saying, okay, why are there conflicts? Places like north of England, why are there conflicts between communities? Rather than dealing with hard issues there, right, around things like schooling and in many cases, the difficulties between communities are driven by incidents like the grooming gang cases, places like Rotherham. Rather than dealing with those incidents or dealing with the idea that we have large sections of the population who are essentially unintegrated into British social norms, we'll just say you can't talk about that, right? That's the shortest route to what the state understands as cohesion, right? Because then there are no public problems. You can't have problems in public. We're making that illegal, right? So then there are no problems, and so we've solved it. Right? This is the circular logic of the state, but it is indeed how the state works. We have basically got such laws on the books, laws designed to prevent tensions between communities and to promote what bureaucrats think of as community cohesion. Now, the thing that is absurd about that is that unlike in a society like Malaysia or Singapore, where communities have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Malay Chinese have been in Malaysia for 300-400 years at least. This is a very new phenomenon, right? People can remember a time when Britain wasn't a multicultural society or was, at a very low level, a multicultural society. Those who are much older will remember a time when it was essentially completely homogenous. And one can argue that, it's a society that's 95% one group homogenous. Well, yes, probably, right, for all intents and purposes. So people can actually remember times when Britain wasn't avowedly a multicultural society. They are now basically being told by law that they can't remember such a time, or that they can't remember their parents' stories of such a time, in the name of that community cohesion drive, right? Speech is one area where it takes effect. I would also, and I bang the drum for this whenever anybody will let me, freedom of association is another. It's very difficult to discriminate on the basis of any protected characteristic in terms of hiring or membership of clubs or anything like that, right? That is a freedom that has essentially been erased under law, and it's all in the name of that cohesion drive.
And so finally, you mentioned earlier the sort of changing of the guard, if you like, from Lord Denning to the likes of Tan-Ikram. And one of the salient features of Tan-Ikram's career is that he's very much been bathed in what you might call the diversity state. So, for instance, he sits on the Judicial Appointments Board, for one thing. He's notably received a CBE under Boris Johnson for whatever services to judicial diversity actually means. And he's also one of the authors of the semi-infamous Equal Treatment Bench Book, which is a guide for judges given to every judge in the land when they take office, and which has, notoriously contained lots of woke language, to do with systemic racism and things like this. And so, what do you think the effect is of having Tan-Ikram and people like him just bathed in this sort of new diversity ideology, and how much of an effect does that have on what we now see as two-tier justice?
Well, let me say this. I studied law. There's a reason I don't practice law. The ideological norms they're more subtle than you might expect. So when you're in these spaces, they are more subtle than you might expect. But that's more dangerous, right? They're not ideas confronted head on, which gives people the space to argue with them. They're taken as essentially a kind of gospel, right? The blasphemy language that you were using before is absolutely appropriate. They're taken as a sort of soft gospel, which is riven through every element of how people think about judicial decision making. The result will be that we have a fairly ideological judiciary moving forward. Right? Many of them will have internalized these things. We should also assume that many of these things will actually become law. Certainly that's the kind of thing that the Labour governments have tended to do, and traditionally, unfortunately, Conservative governments have also tended to turn a blind eye to, or indeed advance. I think where it leaves us, if I had to give a prescription, is that we will soon start hearing calls from the right for politically appointed judges a la America, or certainly at least some measure of political control in the appointment of senior judges. We obviously can't control really without a serious change in requirements and testing, who's going in to study. The current crop will filter through Most of them will become professional judges. The only way to change the kind of person coming in is to change the culture. And if the culture is embedded with people like Tanit, we will get to a position where the right needs to start advocating for basically the right to say, well, when there's a new Supreme Court judge or when there's a new High Court judge up, one minister wants to interview. The Secretary of State for Justice is going to interview people, and we're going to decide who of qualified judges can actually go up and take that position. Now, that would be a real disruption to the way we've done things, but then so is Tanit, right? He's not the norm. We're no longer contending with that old guard of common law judges. We're dealing with a whole new kind of judicial practitioner. And so I suspect that will require a totally new approach.
But of course, that might be necessary at this point, but it would be a shame, right? I mean, you prefer a situation where you could just trust that the judges wouldn't be politicized and would just do the right thing, right?
Well, I'm a great advocate for the common law. I'm a real believer in the brilliance of the common law system and of the kind of subtle it's not a separation of powers. It was a balance of powers that we formed in this country over hundreds and hundreds of years. The problem is that since 1997 and since the Blair government of that time, we've undergone an enormous constitutional shift, right? Almost every area of the Constitution has changed in some way. Devolution, House of Lords, the way the judiciary operates, the way the state operates, quangos, etc. We really are no longer in the pre-1997 Constitution. It sits beneath a layer of bureaucracy. And I think, much as it will be a shame, probably, it's worth remembering that when we're thinking about those judges in 1996 or earlier, they existed in the context of a millennia-long tradition of justice, right? They could point to predecessors, they could point to precedents, they could point to the way things have been done. Those precedents and those predecessors are no longer the cornerstones of those coming into the judicial profession in many cases, right? There are totally new foundational ideas and new shibboleths to the judicial class, which just didn't exist in the pre-Blair era. And so we're, the dangerous thing that the right may fall into here is assuming that because the institution has the same name, it's the same thing. Right? And what we really have is right-wing or traditionally right-wing institutions, right? Not right-wing specifically politically, but certainly right-wing in terms of ideas, which are now worn as a kind of skin suit by those of the diversity left, who take those old ideas, they wear them like a cloak, and they say, look, we're exactly the same thing, right? And unfortunately, they no longer are. Right, the judiciary of Dennings has been thoroughly hollowed out, and we would be, I think, foolish to pretend that we can bring it back by doing nothing. What we probably need is a short, sharp political shock, i.e. political appointments in the case of the judiciary, and then to say, okay, well, we're going to get out of the way. Right, we're going to have a period of political intervention that we're going to get out of the way. And then you can start to allow that kind of discretion. You can allow people to filter back into the system who are genuinely interested in the country's judicial tradition.
Okay, well, it's clear Tony Blair has a lot to answer for. Sam Bidwell, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.
It's a strange thing, the idea of being a conservative these days. Say you go to an art gallery because you love a bit of high culture, and then you're dismayed to find on all the captions on the walls you're being lectured about white supremacy or colonialism or slavery or something else. Maybe you think education is really important, and then you learn that your kids are learning about LGBT ideology in schools, and you think, hold on a second. And perhaps you think law and order is crucial, and you believe in backing the bobbies, but then you learn that the police are going after people for mean tweets, and you think, what the hell is going on here? It's a puzzle. I mean, how are you supposed to conserve something that's clearly going so wrong? Well, to discuss that puzzle today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Niall Gooch, who's a public servant and a writer for publications including The Spectator, The Critic, and Unheard. Welcome to The Sceptic, Niall.
Thanks very much, Laurie.
Okay, so you've written this piece recently for The Critic, Conservatives Can No Longer Trust Institutions. Now, tell us just a bit about yourself and a bit about what prompted you to write this piece.
Yeah, I suppose, as I say, I work in the public sector. I suppose I'm an institution man in some ways. And I would probably, until quite recently, have said that I was, a Burkean conservative, with all that implies about sort of trust in institutions and continuity, and not wanting anything too radical in terms of sort of reform and overthrowing institutions. But I think if you look around now, and if you look at what institutions are actually doing, there's an old saying that I quoted in that piece, which is that the purpose of a system is what it does. So in a sense, whatever an institution was set up originally to do, that's one thing. But I think you need to look at now, what outcomes is that institution actually delivering? What values is it standing up for? And I suppose that's what's really striking to me, that if you look around, look at something like the Church of England, or the police, or Parliament, or something like the art galleries, they've been set up, in some cases hundreds of years ago, with particular purposes in mind, with a particular mission, a particular aim, and a particular place within British society. But actually, in many, many cases, they're no longer fulfilling that aim. They're certainly not.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.